Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. It's a busy time for me. I'm getting ready for a bunch of events and travel around high weirdness. I just got one in the mail, a physical copy, the actual iconic expression of way too many years of work. And I must say, I'm extremely happy with it. I'm not just pushing you out there or mentioning the fact that if you go to the Strange Attractor website, you can order the special edition of the High Weirdness book, which comes with a patch and a little chapbook with some extra writings and a signed book plate, illustrated by Eric Roper, who also did the cover. So Strange Attractor website, High Weirdness, check it out. But I'm very happy. You know, I usually I'm one of those kind of sort of restlessly productive, unsatisfied people who, when I do things, I just see what is kind of bad about them. And for some reason, this time I'm actually able to go, wow, that's really cool. I really like this book. It's got good photographs. It all worked out. Really happy. So that's a nice little spring rejuvenation for me, and I'm feeling the magic in the air, definitely. And magic in the air is a good way to feel for our conversation today with the poet Janaka Stucky, who I first saw. I didn't know anything about him because I'm not that hip to poetry anymore. As you realize, a couple weeks ago, we did another poetry show on James Merrill, who is a dead guy. So I'm usually on the dead guy poet side of things, not because of lack of interest, just lack of reading time. So I was very happy to stumble into a Janaka performance at the Language of the Birds exhibit that Pamela Grossman put together at NYU in 2016, which was a great art event, really wonderful collection of pieces, and there were a few performances that went along with it, including Janaka reading. And Janaka reading is just no joke. I mean, the poetry is rich, esoteric, occult, impassioned, mystical, earnest, over the top, a breath of fresh air, ecstatic in a way that you feel like is almost impossible to get to in our like postmodern, ironic, hyper-mediated times, and you kind of like wonder how he pulls it off. And on the page, you might go, yeah, okay, he's just making those moves with language. Maybe I'm not buying it if you're a more cynical type. Not to say I am. I'm not that cynical when I read poetry. But seeing him live, you're like, woof, this guy is like walking the talk, as they say. And so I want to talk to him about his new book, Ascend. Just a few things about him first. He's not like a James Merrill poet from highbrow literary super New York intelligentsia kind of background. Instead, as you'll be able to tell, he kind of came up with a street poetry style, and he was part of a group called the Guerrilla Poets, and part of their whole purview was to perform poetry outside of its normal context. So really part of that whole sort of revival of beat-influenced street poetry that really exploded a couple of decades ago. And then one thing that we'll talk about more for sure is that he had spent some time leading a neo-burlesque troupe called the Black Cat Burlesque, and sort of being a horror show MC under the name Jay Cannibal. And I want you to keep the horror theme in mind, because when you read articles about Stucky's poetry, they'll talk about the ecstasis, the love, the passion, the mysticism, and all that's true. But so far, nobody talks about the horror. And the horror, I mean, in a way, not only in terms of the genre of horror, but in terms of sacred horror and what the heck sacred horror means. And so I was very pleased to find that this is part of the backdrop. And then just one more bit, his first book on Third Man Books, which is a spin-off of Third Man Records, Jack White's record label, was called "The Truth Is We Are Perfect," which I try to contemplate. It's an impossible thought that nonetheless I think we all must deeply imbibe without denying the contradictions it implies. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. And so rather than the normal, "Hey man, how are you doing? What's going on?" introduction to the show, I thought I'd give you a little slice more of the way I first experienced Stucky, which is to hear him read. So for right now, we're going to hear a brief excerpt from the book-length poem that's coming out soon, Ascend, Ascend.
And I am the crown of strangers, dripping ragged rows of teeth, dripping dabberlocks of kelp, the sightless hunger fanging endlessly into hollow depths. I am the pre-world objectless scape of ink extolling the death bell forever calling each fin to sup. I am the eater of history and darkness fattening my teeth on the wild misery of knives. I am the root of the tongue bit off to guard against the benthic memory of death. I am the ambush of prophecy illuminating the abyssal plain, formless, fathomless insomnia of stars through which angels unendingly dream of filling their ever-widening mouths with the wet muscles of infinite human dead. I explode in blood sublimely, each epoch of my red milk forged to tendrils of perfect knowing in the ceaseless gentle hammering of gills. Here where the worthless rings of history mime the world's hunger. Here where the translucent fruit of sleep capsizes to shadowless nothing. Here where tentacles clench, unclench, and grasp the haunted crystalline tomorrows of our stale and venomous moans. Here where disbanded heavens noon the breathing oath, the leave-taking of our senses senselessly measured now. Here where drowning plants the first kiss of remembering upon the ecstatic lamentation of our descent. I explode in blood sublimely dispossessed, approaching the negative dusk of rainbows extinguished in the belly of a terrible worm. I explode in blood sublimely consumed by the surging tide, smiling wide, soothed in the gore of my undoing, ever widening, smiling wide. I explode in blood sublimely, flushed with fevers, dreaming down, strangling, entwined, forever strangling in the seagrass twining judgment of the flesh. I explode in blood sublimely, the darkness receive me, the water receive me, the infinite sea of my heart receive me, the angels receive me, amid their thrashing enormous flippers receive me, and fins receive me, amid the thunderous gnashing of their unutterable teeth receive me, amid their cavernous and holy gullets receive me, amid great unwinding, threshing tentacles of their tongues receive me, amid the flood of the numinous bile receive me, amid the spectacular mystery of their vengeance receive me, amid the heaviest night of fallen atrocity receive me, amid the sanctuary of their horror, their ancient celestine appetite receive me, amid their glutted cosmic uncoiling receive me, amid their thick and sick and ravenous crowns receive me, their savage enunciation of gore receive me, gargantuan craws thrumming with ichor receive me, I explode in blood sublimely, seething multitudes over sunken mountains, primordial and boundless, bloomed in dilating seraphic veins. I explode in blood sublimely, transparent and eyeless, bristle-mouthed and angling, groping the hadopelagic darkness in bony dimorphic dread. I explode in blood sublimely, fragmented as I am, in the moment so fragile, free from the spell of the world and its shadow, I reach to seize the is of nothing, the fourth dimension of the eternal now, and like an insect I buzz, hallelujah, into the abyss.
Oh man, excellent! Thank you so much for giving us a good juicy slice there. I hope people are just like driving in their cars right now, going, I might have to pull over for a bit." Oh my God.
We we had said I was going to read a more mystical ascension excerpt of the book, and then when you talked about the sacred horror, I said, "Screw it, let's go with the Leviathan angels."
No, I really love that. I mean, the Hallelujah into the Abyss strikes deep chords. I mean, that's one of the things I love about more visionary or ecstatic poetry, is that even, it's like you're invited to try to follow the meaning of the words, and then you realize that that's only going to get you part of the way, and you kind of have to go with the sound of the words, and then you realize that you're actually inviting in this language to trigger associations, memories, dreams, emotions inside of you. And so it's like suddenly you're like, wow, it's like a drug. I'm like going on this inner trip. And there were many points in your poem that brought up, points of mystical horror is only the way I can describe it. Points of psychedelic trips, of nightmares, of deep reading, of late night disturbing thoughts. But I say all that not to say just horror like a genre, but like when the sacred urge, when the yearning for the absolute, the yearning for love, the yearning for connection with the cosmos can't help but confront horror in both the kind of sense of imagery or of gross things, but also a sense of emotion. And I just found out when doing research for this about your kind of, your MC Cannibal background. I'd love to hear about your kind of experience of horror and how that came into your work as a poet.
Yeah, well, your commentary reminds me of one of not only my favorite lines from Rilke, but one that I read early on, I'd say in my early 20s, that was really influential on me not just as a poet, but as a artist in general. And it's early on in his first elegy from the Duino Elegies. And he's actually talking about angels as well. And he says, "For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which we are barely able to endure, and are awed because it serenely disdains to annihilate us." And the idea of these angels being terrifying, that's what awe is. It's that reverence and mixed with dread, because at any moment it could destroy you. It's so awesome. And I believe that can be not only can it be the heart of an aesthetic experience, let's take religion out of it, but just the heart of an aesthetic experience. But that's what I strive for in art, whether it's in burlesque or in poetry or performance, or what I seek out when I want a really fulfilling aesthetic experience. But to go to your question about the Black Cat burlesque. So yeah, I wasn't really the leader of the troupe. I actually started as a very secondary supporting cast member in the troupe. This was sort of at the very nascent early stage of the burlesque revival movement in the early 2000s. And I was actually working as an undertaker at the time, and I was working an overnight shift at the funeral home, and this woman was there wiring the funeral home all night for high-speed internet. And, I could just kind of tell she was kind of cool, and we started talking because we were both there all night. I have to sit there and, embalm people or answer telephones or whatever. And she's there like drilling holes in walls and going up and down the stairs and everything. And long story short, we connected over a mutual love of horror, of B movies, and turned out that she was doing this burlesque performance, and she was really on the vanguard of it. She kind of helped build the burlesque revival scene in Boston. And she had gotten sick of doing the more sort of traditional vintage Peel, cutesy burlesque. And because she loved horror and because she was dating this really great illustrator, Mr. Rushu, could make masks and costumes and everything, they started Black Hat Burlesque as this horror-themed burlesque, which no one was really doing back then. Everything was still very much in that traditional, like, vintage shimmy type of burlesque that you think of, like Vegas burlesque or something. And I thought, oh man, that's so cool. My girlfriend at the time was a dancer and choreographer, and I thought, you guys should connect. She'd probably love to get involved in burlesque, and she's also a horror fan. And I started performing with them just because my girlfriend was doing it. We then got married. It was my first wife. But, just to kind of like be the straight man, we were doing narrative scenes for burlesque. So like every act was this little vignette, and I'd usually play a monster or a straight man or a victim of some kind. And the idea behind what we were doing was, because burlesque itself has sort of complicated with ideas of the male gaze and trying to find feminist ways to turn that on its head. And then horror, of course, also has a long, troubled history with misogyny as well. So we wanted to write these acts where the female was always the final girl, was always the triumphant character in it. And she was either outwitting a monster, or maybe she was more of like a Black Widow character who would seduce and destroy men or whatever. But that's how it got started. And then I almost dropped out. And then I sort of thought, well, because I'm not a dancer and I don't make all this cool visual art. What is there for me there? And then I decided, well, I'm going to create this character, Jay Cannibal. And I love like spook shows and B-movie stuff. And I'm just going to create a spook show night that's like hosted by Jay Cannibal. And my Jay Cannibal character, you can find him online. I've retired him for a number of years now, but it's all like skull makeup and black leather and leopard faux fur bondage pants and everything. And I just started doing these spook show nights in Boston where we would have a zombie costume contest and a live band and live burlesque, followed by some cult film on 35 millimeter. And they just blew up. Like the first one I did, I thought I'd be lucky if I got 50 people to show up. 400 people showed up for it. And then it just kind of took off from there. And I did that for like 10 years.
What a blast, man. That sounds really great. But I love that for a lot of reasons. One is that clearly you've tuned in, at least for me, to one of the most important sort of aspects of horror, which is that it's full of schlock. It's full of problematic, racial, sexual, gender, pathologies, neuroses, whatever. And that in some sense, if you're really going to go through horror for what it is, you kind of have to take a lot of that stuff on and kind of find your way through it. Yeah. But there's also this vein of Iker or whatever, of some kind of cosmic demon blood in it, where it provides an access to the sublime or to the cosmic or to the awesome or to the absolute, and you kind of have to go through the gutters to get there. And I think it's a great, you could be presenting your poetry in a much more high-toned way. We both know occult magicians who take themselves extremely seriously, and they have this kind of radiating, sense of gloom and seriousness. And it's quite effective to certain people. They respond to that. People in the occult respond to that. People in the goth world respond to that. People who are just looking for something that seems more serious than everything in popular culture respond to it. And while your poetry and your persona have a deep seriousness of intent to them, there's a willingness to kind of revel in the excesses of the horror as an aesthetic, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, I think for it kind of works on a couple levels for me. I mean, one is, I grew up in an ashram community. My parents lived in a couple of them when I was a young child, and then we would always return to them on school vacations and things like that.
Who was the guru, if I may ask?
The guru was Baba Muktananda. It was Siddha Yoga ashram, sort of a
Sure.
Yeah. They were actually early adopters. That's how they met. They were on tour with him, and they lived in India for a while, and then they ran a meditation center in France. And then when my mom got pregnant, they came back to the States. And it wasn't just, that was the main tradition that I was raised in, but my mom's side of the family is Jewish. My dad's side of the family is Episcopal. And then they also took me to really every imaginable guru, holy man, holy woman, psychic surgeon tradition that you can, if it existed and it was within like driving distance, they would take me there. But so I got exposed to a lot of that early on. And I mean, it was very much, my parents are very much sort of like bhakti yogis, like they tradition of light and absolute love and sort of like this divine radiance. So probably partially because of that, I got like really interested into like goetic demonology at an early age, and also just observing that, I mean, like so much of that stuff, there's also a dark side to it, or there's a hypocritical side to it, which I think when you're raised in it and you're a very astute and observant child, you pick up on that really quickly as well. And so both because of like my early, you could kind of call it like goth punk adolescence interest in the darker side of the occult, and my upbringing in that sort of light working traditions, that's always the balance of those two is one I've always vacillated between in my work. Like it is both, and I try not to overcorrect either way, and try not to be like, oh, the world's a really dark and ugly place, so I only want to focus on the light, or like you were talking about, oh, too many people are focused on the light, I'm going to be the Antichrist, like it's neither, it's both, and I love some of the contemporary traditions that really play with that, like the Process Church and, Lucifer and Lightbringer, but also satanic character. And so from a sort of mystical or spiritual perspective, I like walking that line. And then from an aesthetic perspective, yeah, I mean, I early on in my poetry, as I was developing it, I was much more of like an MFA workshop poet, trying to sort of write in the Iowa style of like reserved narrative, quiet work. And then I just thought, that this isn't me. Like I want drama. I want my early loves were like German romantics and French surrealists. And that's the imagery and the sort of maximalist aesthetic that I wanted to bring into my work. And it might not be as in vogue in contemporary poetry right now, sort of in the more academic world of contemporary poetry. But that's what speaks to me, and that's what excites me.
Well, I mean, it also requires a whole journey on your part. I mean, to become that kind of poet in the context where there's so much emphasis on other modes of poetry, you've got to go in your own journey. You can't just like decide to do that. You got to like put yourself into doing that, and that's of course part of what comes across. And indeed, part of the backstory of Ascend, which we heard a small portion of earlier, is that you not only put yourself into a ritual context over 20 odd days, and I want to find out more about that, what you set out to do and how you, what kind of practices you had and what you were willing to try as a kind of inspiration or a sort of sight of a different kind of writing. So I'm interested in that, but I also want to, note right up on top that I'm also interested in the decisions you make as an artist to tell us that, like how you ride the tricky line of writing who you are, where you're from, what's going on with you, and then recognizing that there's a certain kind of quote unquote authenticity that then becomes part of how you are represented in the world. And those two things can be really interesting and have lots of tensions in them. So I just love to hear like how Ascend as a sort of ritual project as well as a poetic project, got going, and how you carved out that time, and how you set yourself up in a way to go through this rather harrowing journey that is recorded or simulated with these wonderful words.
Yeah. So I think before I talk specifically about the book, but you asked a little bit about my choices as an artist to do what I do. So ascend aside, as a poet, working in, I guess, a more mystical tradition of poetry, I think a lot about how on a semantic level, we create the world through language, and there's biblical precedent for that. There's Talmudic or Vedic precedent for that. And so that, and in a more philosophical precedent, there's no thought without words. But from a magical perspective, that's basic level. That's a cantrip, and so the language or the magical power of language can be so much more if we wield it with intention. And that's what I love about poetry, that a great poem takes language, this material that's accessible to everyone, and it shapes it into a powerful spell. And all the techniques of poetic craft, metaphor, meter, image, symbolism, rhyme, all of those craft elements are also elements of a ritual.
Yeah, even just like just some basic prosody. I mean, just the way that you enunciate. It's interesting, like having done some ceremonial magic, and so then you're doing it with a group where there's a script, so it's like scripted, Golden Dawn tradition kind of style, and then you have these scripts and people are playing roles. And, bless their hearts, but some people just aren't readers. And so it's like, comes off like real cornball, right? Like bad, like high school theater thing, or, like goths or something. But like, I have a good reading voice. I studied poetry in college, and, I can, I can read. So I could take even the kind of trivial things and then, turn them into these events, and it would sound really good. But then I could sort of do that with a phone book if I wanted to,
Right. Well, yeah, of course it helps if you have like a background in theater or something like that. I mean, I also have that. But I think even beyond that, I mean, you could still have that experience or that skill, that timbre in your voice. And if you're not invested in it, there's still something that's going to be hollow about it. And I do want my readings to be initiatory. There's something about that performative moment where our consciousness is altered. And even when I'm not reading something like Ascend that is a mystical text, even when I'm reading, doing a poetry reading where I'm reading a number of, love poems or other material, I don't choose anything to read that I'm not feeling in that moment on that day. I don't go into a reading 2 days before being like, oh, I'm going to read these poems. I kind of like the hour before the reading, I sort of pick my set list, or even in the moment, just kind of feel my way into it. And that's because I never want to utter a poem without concentration. I want to be in it. I want to be in the moment, and I want to be feeling it. And through that, sanctifying it, knowing it, reflecting on it. And I think that you talked about the ceremonial magic or the groups and the rituals. I mean, a spell is not a spell. Like, I don't know if you read Damien Eccles' new book, High Magic, but he talks about how like spell books are just recipe books. Like the ingredients of the spell or the ceremony, that's just a recipe, and it doesn't contain any inherent power in it. It's the intention and the energy that you inject it with as a magician that gives it its power. And I think that that's true about reading a poem or doing a performance too, is that when not only do I have to go into this trance state when I'm writing the work, but I have to go into that state when I'm performing it as well.
Well, one of the interesting things that raises, it comes up with kind of, chaos magic is, in a way, chaos magic is premised on that point. There's nothing inherent in the system, in the Golden Dawn, the names of God. Nothing is in it. It's all about intent and performance and event, what's actually happening in that event. But it's interesting that then a lot of people go in certain directions with that. And one side is that there's still a kind of irony about invocation, particularly in a kind of public context, because you're not really sure where people are, and so you want to like let people know that, hey, it's okay, we're going to play here. So there's a lot of that tension, and you also find that in the horror genre. There's a lot of humor in horror films because they actually want to undercut their potential to be really powerful. But the problem is that without the humor, you just go one step too far, and then it becomes self-parodying and absurd. How do you walk that line? I mean, it's just that where you're not funny. I'm not going to be funny here, and that seriousness is an invitation for you to maybe confront things that you're not quite ready for. But for you, it's also a bit of a high wire act because it's hard to be serious about this stuff in a way in public.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the way that I find the balance as an artist performing it, or just as sort of like a public identity, is that I let the work itself be serious, because it is. I mean, it is. It comes from this like very introspective, but also ecstatic, like completely sincere, unironic place and experience. But I can, outside of the work, have a sense of humor about it. I don't consider myself a guru. I don't consider myself a prophet, even though I consider the work prophetic. And we can talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the book. But so when I do a reading, if I'm out there performing in front of an audience, though, I can recite the work itself with intensity and with unmitigated earnesty. But then my stage banter outside of that can be self-effacing, can be humorous. I can make jokes, I can, whatever. And it, kind of weave back into that, just so like I take the work very seriously, but that doesn't mean I take myself seriously.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of the best ritual I've been to has had that character. Even inside the ritual, there's been points where amidst, high seriousness, there's a bit of space for that self-awareness, which almost lets the ego kind of breathe a sigh of relief, and then it's up for another round, to really go back in. And like, again, it has a kind of psychedelic trip aspect to it. But let's talk about Ascend, Descend. And I mean, you could tell the story of the composition, but I'm also just interested in the very topic. I mean, Ascent, that is like... Yeah. That is serious stuff. I mean, it's and I'll preface it by saying I thought about it a little bit when I was writing High Weirdness, and there's one section of the book that's actually in the, like I'm going to put on my website because I ended up cutting it from the actual book. But I was thinking about the word high and high weirdness. I was like, what does that mean, high? What does it mean to be high? Why do we say drug people to take drugs to get high? Why are the gods up high? Where does all this come from? And you find this like deep metaphoric structuring, obviously in religion, where there's stairways to heaven and ladders and world trees and angels up above and clouds and literal ascents. Your Kabbalistic references are embedded in this Hecalot literature that comes from the late antiquity and the whole movement of the mystic into the heavens and back and up and down and da-da-da. But and then you deal with this really well, is that, but nowadays we're reasonably quite suspicious of the ascent impulse, because we can see how ascending and the religions of ascent, the religions of the high above the low, have led to a lot of the imbalances of contemporary culture, of Christianity, of people's ideas about the body, about nature, about women. And so you both honor the ascent literature, and you take it on, reproduce it, or find your own way through those Empyrean heavens, but you also subvert it and transgress it in really interesting ways. Was that something you were like intending to do, or did that just emerge from the practices that led to the poem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the short answer is no, it was not my intention. I really didn't even know what I was intending. I didn't know what was happening, and I've actually spent like a year unpacking the poem after I wrote it. But before I go down that rabbit hole, part of that, I think that suspicion or that skepticism that you talk about with this sort of ascension religion, I mean, it's warranted. But the important thing to also remember is that, like, Kabbalah or Hasidic Judaism, I mean, that was at the time in when it sort of came to the forefront, in these medieval scholars, they were the rebels. They were the ones who, it was a reaction to this traditional rabbinical Judaism. And it's a natural cyclical order that, the old order someone rises up, or a movement rises up against the old order, it overthrows it, or it gets integrated. And then that new order becomes the old order, And as I've been unpacking the work, I've been thinking a lot about that and sort of preparing, because as I get ready to go on my book tour, I have some engagements with JCCs and other Jewish orgs and Jewish audiences, and I'm kind of like building my case or being prepared to defend my position in Jewish mystical literature. But to go back to the question that you sort of led off with, was that my intention? No, I actually really didn't know almost anything about ascension literature when I wrote Ascend Descend. So the way that it came about was, kind of have to go back a number of years. And this ties into your book, which, by the way, I'm super excited about. And I didn't know about that special edition, so I'm pretty pumped about that. I'm going to pre-order that now. But going back a number of years, I'm from my youth, pretty experienced psychonaut, although I don't partake very often anymore. But a friend of mine gave me some DMT. I'd never done DMT before. So I sort of, read a little bit about it, read a chapter or two in DMT, the Spirit Molecule. I read a little bit of McKenna's stuff. And then I was like, all right, I'm just going to kind of prepare myself. I was nervous about it because I hadn't really done any hard psychedelics in a number of years at that point. But I, did the whole set and setting thing, spent a couple of days not eating meat, getting really relaxed and getting into a really great mental space. And then my friend and I smoked the DMT and had a really amazing experience with it that was really hard to put into words, but a beautiful experience. And part of that experience was I had this very tangible noetic vision of this sort of structure constructed out of light with all these spinning concentric wheels and beings of light shooting up and down. And a few months after that, I'm talking to a different friend of mine and I'm describing what I saw in DMT. And he says, dude, it sounds like you saw the Merkaba. And I hadn't even heard that word. I mean, I grew up, again, my family's Jewish, but I think like a lot of Jews, I had no real exposure to Jewish mysticism. And so I didn't even know the word. I said, "What's the Merkaba?" And he explained to me, Heckelot literature and Ezekiel's vision and Merkaba. And I went and read Ezekiel's vision. I said, "Yeah, this chariot of God that Ezekiel is describing is what I saw." And I say that with the caveat that what I saw could also be described as a UFO, or it could also be described as Terence McKenna's machine elves.
But that's in the literature too. That's what's weird about when you read not just Ezekiel, but you go and you read some of the Heckelot literature, and you're like, my God, this is so sci-fi. This is so fucking weird. Just like angels with eyes all over their wings. That's crazy.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting in that sense that if you pull back a little bit and you just think of that out there is this, I was going to say Gnostic, but I want to even strip it further out from that, but it just like pure data, right? And that we experience that data, through a variety of lenses. And if you're Jewish, then you're going to experience it as God's utterance, and if you're Christian, probably also that way. But if you don't have those frameworks, then maybe you're going to experience it as a UFO abduction or whatever cultural lens that you bring to it. And I think that's what's really interesting about, I'm going to say prophecy, again, because I'm talking through the Jewish lens here. But when I say prophecy, I just want to make it clear, I'm not talking about prediction or divination, but, divine experience. I think a lot of people, when they think prophecy, they think prediction. But a direct personal experience of the divine. And that's a subjective experience. And we communicate that based on whatever imaginative and intellectual capacities that we possess. And so when I started trying to then communicate that experience, when I started writing Ascend Descend, because ultimately I decided to go back into that state and witness that chariot and ascend through the heavenly palaces and do it without DMT. That was then I was able to do that with more intention and more sort of knowledge, and come in and out and filter it both through my imagination and my intellect and then pour it out as a poem.
That reminds me of one of the moments I really love in the poem where you talk about the great shame. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this poem from a literary and a aesthetic, literary and a kind of religious point of view or spiritual point of view, I don't really like either of those words.
Yeah, I know.
Somewhere between the two, spiritual's too, it's like kind of limp noodle, and religion's a little much, whatever. But is your embrace of these difficult emotions, your embrace. We can talk about the horror that's in the awe or the sublime, like staring into space and imagining the infinite voids. You get kind of freaked out. Yeah. That's true. But there's something that's much closer to home that in a way is kind of like the human emotional analog of some of those feelings. But these are feelings like shame, like profound shame, like existential shame and dread, where it's like, dread is a good friend of mine. I know dread well. It's often hard to know what to do with it. And not everybody resonates on the dread frequency. So it's a little bit odd, but you really created a lot of room for these emotions, but you also kind of made them mean, in not in a programmatic way, but in a way where like, taking them on, going through them, and going through the horror and the horrible images and the overwhelming images and the, deliciously fecund, bizarre images that arise from them. It offered me at least a way to kind of move through them and kind of accept them in a way. But there's something specific about the great shame that you talked about. And I just want to read this part because it has to do with a lot of the
Yeah.
themes you were just talking about, where you talk about the great shame in which I establish the ecstasy that can never be established in words, but which I struggle unceasingly to establish in words. And that I want to hear about, is there a link between shame and this apophatic problem, this problem of mysticism that you're talking about something you can't talk about? It's this classic problem in mysticism and mystical language, mystical poetry. But the introduction of the shame changed the whole equation for me. So how are you thinking about this great shame as a kind of moment in a spiritual journey?
Yeah, well, so this actually goes back into the genesis story of the book, which I've kind of danced around a little bit. But I started writing the book on an artist retreat at this place called the Star and Snake in New Hampshire, which is a 100-year-old Catholic church that these two artists bought and now live in, and also turned into an artist residency, but an artist residency specifically for artists who have like occult and esoteric influences in their practice. So I got accepted to the residency to go up there for a couple of weeks and write. And the book I had intended to write, I had been making notes towards in this little notebook for almost 2 years, which is just kind of how I work. I don't write for a long period of time, but I'm reading a lot and experiencing a lot and sort of writing little fragments of language. And then I sit down and create. So I had this notebook of all these notes towards a new book. And that book was supposed to be a book-length love poem to Jean Genet. The night before I left for the residency, I'm packing up all my stuff for the residency, and the notebook's lost. Like, I can't find it anywhere. And I'm devastated. I mean, not only am I devastated, but I'm sort of in shock because, I've made all these preparations to take off from work for a couple of weeks, to unplug from life, from email, from family. Everyone's going to leave me alone, and I'm going to go do this book that I've been imagining for 2 years. And now all my materials for that book are gone. And I've actually never found that notebook. I don't know what happened to it. Disappeared.
Wait, I have to say it's weird. It's a weird little synchronicity, because in James Merrill's The Changing Light at Sandover, we were talking about the first book, the Book of Ephraim, and one of the backstories of that poem is that he in order to write about his Ouija board experiences, he first wrote a novel, and he didn't finish it, and then he lost the manuscript. So that kind of inspired the poem. Anyway, go on, please.
Yeah. So I almost just bailed like the night before, and my wife actually talked me off the ledge and encouraged me to go, and she, said just treat it like an opportunity and create something new. She didn't cite Merrill, but that was the intention. So I just said, all right, I'll go. I'll figure something out. And then when I got there, because of the nature of the residency, it turned out there were a few other artists there who happened to be either sort of more formal students of Kabbalah and Thelema, or at least armchair philosophers of it. But it was through, I started just having conversations in the first couple of days, and then processing those conversations, as well as sort of fragments of what I had lost in this Genet poem coming back to me. And I started writing, and then as I started, and my writing process, by the way, has always involved trance. So I would be meditating and then writing, and meditating and writing. And that started taking me into higher and higher places. And then I started, there's a great library there at Star and Snake too. And one of the owners, Natan, gave me a couple of books to browse through and read on Kabbalah. And I started, just kind of using Kabbalah as a scaffolding or a vessel upon which I was able to give form to these amorphous mystical experiences I was having. And then a few days in, that's when like the structure of this book gelled for me, and I knew that I was going to ascend through the material planes and through the heavenly palaces and try to describe this vision that I had originally seen on DMT, but do that through like real ritual, magical, somatic practices and meditation, but that structure of ascension enabled me to develop a narrative structure for the poem. And like I said, I used the Kabbalah because I'm Jewish and because I was interested in working in that tradition, and because of the materials and the peoples that were available to me at the time of my ascent. Because otherwise, that type of ascension experience exists outside of time and outside of narrative, outside of description. So I had to choose some sort of lingua franca to translate that mystical experience into, and in this instance, it was Kabbalah. But what also crept into there was this epic queer love poem that I had originally intended to write to Jean Genet. And if you're a fan of Genet's work, he also has this sort of, Saint Genet, where, but his tenets are like deception, thievery, betrayal, and through like denouncing everyone, that is how you attain sainthood. But shame is a big part of his trope too. So I sort of brought all of that in with me, and this idea of shame and ego death being part of the experience of the divine works its way into the poem and into that specific section of the poem as well.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. It's amazing. Again, it's like the Merrill thing, where how an absence or a frustration, a creative frustration, sets the stage for something else, and it's a good lesson for us all in terms of not getting what we think we want, and going on forward. But one of the things that happens in the poem is, of course, there's an ascent. There's this sense of moving upwards into the heavens, into these other dimensions. But then there's also this descent. We got a nice slice of that at the beginning, where we're like back into the gushy stuff, and like the no escape, and into the body, and into the gross parts of the body, and all of these sort of domains that are in a more typical old school esoteric or cosmic system would be the low. Yeah. So I want to talk just a little bit. We only got, unfortunately, about 5 minutes here, although hopefully I'll keep you on for a little bit for our the extra nibbles I like to give our soon to come Patreon folks. I will do it. But anyway, moving to the question, is what now, like thinking about now is still a time when prophecy is possible. Now is still a time when serious spiritual ecstatic work is both possible and, for some of us, absolutely necessary just to stay alive, just to stay in tune. It's related to the conditions of the world. It's related to the conditions of history, even if it doesn't entirely mesh. What is the importance now, do you see, of including that descent, that horror, even that no transcendence in a old school way again, as part of sacred work?
Yeah, well, if we think about prophecy and the way the medieval scholars think about prophecy, that there are sort of two opposing or main thoughts on what prophecy is or what makes a prophet. And you can achieve prophecy as a way of through a path of perfecting the individual through preparations, both spiritual and physical and mental, or it's prophecy as a mission, that God just chooses the prophet and that is your mission and you were given to prophecy. I tend to subscribe more to the former, and that you can, through your discipline, through whatever discipline it is, it can be yoga, it can be meditation, it can be, recombining the names of God, whatever your tradition is, but you can do that through a path of perfection. but perfection doesn't mean flawless. It just means complete and becoming a complete individual. And part of that path, part of that journey is this ego death. And that's where this ugliness and this horror comes in. To then talk about Buddha, that's the Maya, the illusion of the world being stripped away. And that is terrifying. That is a horrific, terrifying, panic-inducing experience. That's the cosmic horror. But if we pass through that, if we get chewed up by these angels or these old gods or whatever you want to call them, and then what's left is this essence, and that's what ascends. It's the category that, or the part of the consciousness that has no category to put anything in, and that's the nothingness of the divine, I guess.
So in that sense, do you see a connection between that aspect of ascend descend in your earlier work as Jay Cannibal?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. For me, those horror events, that horror burlesque, is I wanted to create a moment in time, a collective moment. That was a ritual where we could all lose ourselves in this revelry, and then in that's a moment of freedom. That's a moment of transcendence.
Yeah, absolutely, and that comes through very well. In her introduction to your book, Pam Grossman talks about taking it out to the woods and reading it aloud, and it's very much that kind of book. I mean, I find myself reading it aloud in my room, and it just made all the difference. I mean, it really has that extra dimension, because not just because it sounds good spoken and resonating and with the rhythms that the language calls for, but because it turns your own reading into more of a ritual. I mean, reading is a ritual itself, but it's more embodied when read aloud. And I encourage people to find the book. I very much encourage you to go to Janaka's website and check out, see if you can see him read live. It's totally awesome, worth the trip, and to get Ascend Descend. And so, Janaka, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Eric. This was really fun.
Excellent. All right, folks, until next week, keep your minds open.